So, moving on with our topic of 18th century English colonies. Let's go back, however, to our early discussion of English settlement in the beginning of the 1600s. And as we noted, we specified three particular variants of early English settlement. That would be New England, for example, with the Puritan society that emerged there, Chesapeake region, with its distinctive commercial approach and monocrop agricultural system. And then we talked about the experimental colonies, right? Maryland, Pennsylvania, and how unique they were. So the idea we got from that is that there's remarkable difference between all three of the earliest settlement patterns. And this is what made it different, of course, from earlier French, Dutch, and especially Spanish colonization during the 1500s. So, in view of this differentiation, and by the way, we'll see that differentiation transfer over, it will prevail into the following century, the 18th century. So, during the 1700s, we still see remarkable differentiation. Of course, we see, as we discussed, geographic expansion, population growth that's exponential, and so on and so forth. Regardless of this growth, we still notice that there's remarkable differentiation. Now, some of it is obvious because in the middle colonies, for example, we notice this influx of non-English immigrants coming in. So that's an obvious contributory factor, if you will, to this differentiation. But even putting aside that, that is to say, immigration from other parts of Europe, um, despite the fact that they're all English, and they're English speaking, and they are subjects of the English monarchy. Putting that aside, we still notice, as I mentioned, remarkable difference between the areas, despite all the growth that happens in the 18th century colonies. So, this leads to the question, as noted here on this slide, namely, what unifying experiences can we locate among the English settlers in the New World by the 18th century in view of the fact that there's this, tremendous differentiation that we notice? Okay. So again, we notice there's so much difference between the different areas or different geographical regions, different economics, different politics, different religion, of course. Yet at the same time, what we're going to talk about in this discussion, in this subtopic under 18th century colonialism, is the unifying experiences that can be located in virtually all parts of English settlement of the New World, in North America to be specific. Okay, so what I delineated here in this slide are four areas we're going to discuss in depth. Okay, consumerism, consumer culture, religion, and we'll talk about something called the Great Awakening, but also this notion of how religious freedom will affect governance or our approach to governance. We'll talk about social stratification and how it compares with, say, feudalism. And finally, we'll talk about something called the public sphere. So, again, the argument that's being made here is despite this difference, we could locate specific areas whereby the English, in their experiences in the New World, all share, all have in common. All right, so I should say this, that, and this is quite important actually, consider this just as important as the larger question, right? I just explained the broad question of trying to locate unifying experiences through the four areas. Now, embedded in this argument is this: how do all four areas actually serve to promote democratization? Okay, democratization. Now, don't be confused with the term democratization. It doesn't necessarily mean as it doesn't correspond perfectly to democracy. Okay, as a form of government, you probably know that democracy is ruled by the people, right? And how could you say that when they're ruled by the English crown, right? They're all English subjects, not citizens, in other words. Well, what we mean by democratization is something more broad, and it describes the movement away from sort of feudal approach to governance, that is to say, getting away from the overarching authority of, say, a monarch or an emperor, and more towards notions of equality, um, rights and freedoms, natural rights, as we will call them, and so on and so forth. The various things we take for granted, articles of faith, if you will, in our contemporary democratic system today. So, in other words, yes, there is democracy ruled by the people, but there's also this phenomenon that happens in the movement towards democracy that kind of precedes democracy. It, if you will, lays the ground for it. It lays the conditions of possibility for full-fledged democracy to actually exist. All right, and that's this process of democratization, which again involves this inexorable but slow movement still towards ideas and practices such as personal freedom or natural rights, um, equality, and so on and so forth. Okay, even ideas of mobility in society, upward mobility, and getting away from the rigid feudal social structure. Okay, so again, let me lay out the question that's posed before us. The first question is this. Um, in light of the fact there's all this broad differentiation describing the English colonies during the 18th century, what specific unifying experience are shared by all throughout North American colonies despite their difference? And moreover, the second nested argument in this, if you will, is this. When we closely examine each four areas that are shared, how does each area promote democratization? So here is sort of my approach to this. I'm describing each four area that unify the English or that serve as shared and common experiences as exerting a, quote, leveling effect, unquote. Okay, a leveling effect. And what I mean by this, broadly construed, is that it's reshaping the social landscape. Okay, imagine, if you will, a vertical axis versus a horizontal one. When we discuss feudal society, let alone, pre-feudal society, that is to say, during the ancient times, we noted that those societies are very rigid, very hierarchical, and therefore it could be described as sort of a vertical axis, right? When you think of verticality, you think of north or south, right? On the top, you can even think of a pyramid, by the way. On the top of the pyramid or this vertical axis is, maybe the king, or depends on the society. Maybe it's the priest if you're in a particular part of the world where religion reigns, okay? But nonetheless, you have this ruler on the top, and then that's followed by different degrees of the elite. In European society before modern times, you had, for example, nobility or the aristocracy. And then you have degrees below them, let's say the peasant class, and even the peasantry itself admits to degrees, right? Rich peasants versus middle peasants versus poor peasants. And of course, you have the indentured servants and then the lowly slaves in the very bottom, right? That's a vertical axis, if you will. That's a vertical or a pyramid. Let's think of a pyramid, Okay, the apex of the pyramid with the elite on top, and the very bottom, the base of the pyramid, is the peasantry. Now, what I'm arguing in terms of leveling effect, if you recall that term I just introduced a few minutes ago, is that axis based on verticality. What's happening here is the four areas are exerting impact upon that vertical axis, whereby it's becoming more horizontal. Okay, so imagine a horizon, right, or a horizontal plane. What image you should have is, on this horizon, people, for example, are standing on this horizon and looking at each other eye to eye, so to speak. In other words, it symbolizes, in a social sense, more equality, as opposed to that, again, pyramid or that hierarchy or that vertical axis. So what's happening again is these four areas again are exuding or exerting some influence upon that vertical axis, making it more horizontal. It's exerting a leveling effect. It's making it more level. Now, I don't want to exaggerate, by the way. I don't want to claim that, let's say in 1763, if we look at all four areas, everyone's equal. That's hardly the case, but we notice that it's definitely exuding or exerting this leveling effect to the point where it's certainly more horizontal than, let's say, Europe, let alone other parts of the world, let's say India or China, or what we call the Middle East today. Okay, so that's the embedded argument, the second part of the argument. So just keep that in mind as we go through each four areas. What we're going to discuss first is consumer culture. So the first leveling effect, so to say, that we're going to discuss, that is the first shared experience had by almost all English subjects in the New World. I should say almost all, because there's always some exceptions. But nonetheless, the first shared experience would be their participation in what we could call consumer activity. Okay, they were immersed in something called consumer culture, right? So this is broadly understood as the concept of consumerism. Now, some of you may have a hint of what this refers to, right? In fact, I introduced it a while back, but here we'll be a little more specific about what it means, what it suggests. And first of all, we have to acknowledge that it's something that we can't avoid today. It's inescapable in our everyday life today. We are consumers, and we can't escape that unless we become hermits somewhere in the world. Okay, we consume commodities, and in the most broadest construal of consumerism, that's what it means. You consume commodities. All right, so what this reminds us is that after the initial period of English settlement, when things began to stabilize, and indeed, as we discussed in the first video of this topic, 18th century colonial America, as the English colonies began to prosper and grow tremendously, economically speaking, you see the market in the New World becoming very important to the English transatlantic economic system. Okay, so consumerism is what describes this. Okay, the English colonials are going to be avid consumers of, in particular, English finished goods, whether these are basic necessities like, let's say, paper or a mirror, or even more luxurious items like fancy clothes, fashionable clothes, fancy furniture, books, things that they would consider luxury items back then. Whether basic necessities or luxuries, they are consumers of English goods. So, this is something that's modern, in other words. So, this reminds us that economically, one can argue that our colonial history never had a pre market um, phase, if you will, a pre market way of life. From the beginning, we've always had consumerism practiced. All right. So, if you look at the definition here, and these are two definitions. The second one is a bit more abstract, more sociological, but I think it's actually a good one. The first one, though, let's look at that because it's more straightforward. Consumerism refers to a worldview, ideology, or a way of life whereby consumption of goods or commodities, right, produced by the market, and I should say sold by the market, right, is centrally important. And I even made the claim today, at least, it's inescapable. So that's pretty straightforward, right? It's basically saying that you're immersed in this economic system that hinges upon the consumption of commodities. For example, just think about that basic dichotomy between supply versus demand, right? That's, again, a fundamental part of our modern capitalist system. When you think of supply, you're thinking about those who produce commodities or goods. Today, that would be, places like Starbucks or Walmart, or other places like restaurants, McDonald's. They're producing the food we eat, right? So that's the supply side. The demand side obviously involves consumption, right? The consumers. They are the ones who are buying the goods, and when you have this interrelation, or this interaction between demand and supply, it's what really um, makes our economy work, right? So that's why it's so fundamental to our understanding of modern economics. So the whole point here is this, that there's always been not only supply, but demand in the New World, and it reaches a heightened um, state, if you will, right before the American Revolution, where consumption of goods, consumerism, is pretty much part of their everyday life. Now, what makes it possible for your average English person, English colonial, to consume? Again, remember the backdrop of economic prosperity. A surprising number of people, by those standards in the 18th century, are prosperous to the degree or to the point where they could participate in consumerism. All right. Now, the second um, definition basically states that the market mediates between our interpretations of value. So here's value is central here in this definition, and the material means to fulfill those values. Okay, so if you really analyze that abstract definition, it's saying that what mediates or comes between what we, if you will, our inner sense determines as valuable, and how we, realize those values in the material world, right? The external world beyond our innerscape, if you will, is the market. That's what mediates between that. Now, it could easily be religion, right? As something that mediates between our interpretations of what's valuable and what's valuable out in the world, right? Could be something like religion or nationalism, right? One's allegiance to nation. But here it's an actual, entity, if you will, even though it's socially constructed, I should say, but put that aside for now. The market is an institution in this case, more broadly understood as mediating between what we deem as valuable and the means to achieve it. Now, if you look in the parentheses, This means that consumerism or consumption of goods is not merely just a means to, let's say, survive, but it's an end in itself. It's just something we do, right, without even thinking about it. All right, so let me describe how this exerts a leveling effect here. Okay, so when we think about consumerism again, we're thinking about demand. And if you look at that first part of the slide, it says the colonies, think of the colonies as not just in terms of supply, but also demand. English imports multiply eightfold between 1700 and 1763. Eightfold, right? So, in other words, you see English distributors and producers recognizing that the colonies across the Atlantic Ocean, the New World, is an important market for their finished goods. So they increase their exports towards, the New World market, and they start to depend on them as consumers. So that's what explains the eightfold increase here, right, between those years. So again, this is a shared experience, and the background for this, let me repeat, is that this is enabled by the general rise in prosperity and even wealth that was had by a lot of English subjects in the New World. Okay, so what was the nested argument, if you will? That is to say, how does consumerism in this case promote democratization? Or to use our term, how does consumer culture exert a leveling effect upon colonial society whereby it makes things more horizontal rather than vertical in a social sense, right? So here's how it works. And this is something, again, we take for granted today. Let me use a present day example. Today, we participate in consumerism and to the point where we buy certain things that are not only needs but wants. Okay, needs, you can imagine, are things like food and shelter and clothes, but wants are things that aren't exactly necessary to sustain life, but they're things that we just basically desire as commodities, like, let's say, the new iPhone that comes out, or a new MacBook, or the 2021 new, let's say, Mercedes, right? So these are needs. And by the way, we often confuse the two, right? And that's the job of advertising, to make wants seem like they're needs. But putting that aside again for now, how does our consumer activity promote this idea of democratization? Well, it's this, that all the consumer goods that are available on the market are not exclusive to a particular social class, right? It's built in a way that they're generally available to most people across the broad spectrum of consumers. All right. For example, once upon a time in, say, feudal society, only the elite can, for example, obtain things like the fanciest furniture or the fanciest clothing, right? There was no market available because for poor, because it's not that economic system that promotes that, right? And not only that, society, to use our term, was hierarchical, it was vertical, right? But all of a sudden the market comes along, and if you put general prosperity behind that, that's more broadly gained by the broad mass of the population, that means that they could spend their money on things that normally they were excluded from in previous, economic systems. So interestingly enough, what you see in the case of the New World, and again, let me remind you, there's no pure feudalism here that would prevent this from happening. What you see instead are consumers able to buy things that are not just needs but wants. Now, again, let me bring a modern day example. A person like myself of the middle class could actually buy, let's say, a 2021 Mercedes Benz. Okay, I could probably do this now. I personally don't have a desire to do so, but I could do it if I wanted. Now, it might take a while for me to do it as a person of the middle class. I might have to save for a down payment to make sure my credit is really good. I have to make sure this and that, right? That I can afford it, the monthly payments. However, in principle, I can do it. And that's opposed to someone who lives in La Jolla who's really rich, a multimillionaire who could just buy it with no barriers, right? But nonetheless, I could do it. And so could practically anyone who meet the conditions in middle class society. So what does that do? Again, look at that. It builds in a certain material uniformity that cuts across region, race, religion, and status. Ordinary citizens could imitate their social betters through consumerism. So my act of buying or consuming, so to say, the latest model of Mercedes-Benz, next year, the fact that I could do so and I'm enabled to, is me imitating, in many ways, my social betters, right? Again, the wealthy person could do it no problem. In fact, they do so regularly to flaunt their wealth as a signifier of their elite status. I could imitate their eliteness, if you will, through my consumption of it. And indeed, if I'm driving through La Jolla, someone might just mistakenly believe I live in La Jolla or Del Mar, think whatever, or wealthy areas of San Diego. And no one knows except for me and perhaps my friends and my family know that I'm not really an elite. I'm just imitating them. So it's not only applicable to, let's say, automobiles, it's applicable to fashion. You could buy the latest fashions, Armani suits or what have you, designer shoes. Again, for the middle class, you might have to extend credit to these people, right? But they could engage in consumerism. And a lot of times when you're consuming not needs but wants, not all the time, but oftentimes you're doing it for a sense of, if you will, elite distinction. Okay, that is, you're buying, and elite doesn't necessarily mean wealthy. It could be, the latest Nike fashion, right? You're buying, you maybe, influenced by the latest shoe by LeBron James, and you want to buy it, right? That elevates your status, right? And that's the whole idea here. You could consume goods, and you're therefore on the same plane horizontally, right? It's not like you're stuck at the bottom. In fact, you could be in a poor neighborhood, let's say in Chicago, and somehow obtain, let's say, an Armani suit in that poor neighborhood, and that would make you seem as if you're elite, and you may feel like you're elite, when in fact you're just imitating them. So what's happening in the colonies, going back to that, is that the English colonials in the New World, and again, this is enabled through their widespread prosperity that they attained, are able to buy these consumer goods and a lot of these luxury items, so to say. In England, you notice that the elite are buying certain fashions, certain, fancy, let's say, furniture for their houses. The elite in Virginia, the elite in Boston, the elite in Philadelphia are going to imitate their elite in England. Okay, they're going to consume the same things. And guess what? Even the so-called middle class, now there's no actual middle class yet as we know it. Maybe you could call them the middle ranks, but let's just call them ordinary citizens. The persons of ordinary rank, if they could save up, in this case, they could buy those same things too. Okay, so Imagine, if you will, even that Scots-Irish immigrant on the fringe of the American frontier, right? The market becomes so pervasive, it's so ubiquitous and rampant to the point where even, that Scots-Irish frontiers person, that family, could make a trip to the store, the country store, and that store might even sell like a fancy clock from England. And maybe the wife would really want that clock. One day, it's a wish, right? I want to put this on my fireplace. And they decide to save for it for years and years and years. And finally, they do buy it. And they put it on, again, on the mantle, right? Of their, even their log cabin, right? It could be. So that's enabled in the new world. You don't see that practice to the same degree in the old world as it is in the new world. Okay, so again, recapping how consumerism is important in the 18th century. Well, it's a shared experience again, regardless of differentiation, whether New England or Philadelphia or New York, or a plantation in Virginia. They're all consumers. Okay, they're all avid consumers. And moreover, we notice that through the consumption of these goods, it exerts this leveling effect, whereby even ordinary persons can imitate or be on the same level, if you will, as their social betters, right? And think back to democratization again, right? What's happening here, it's not, of course, again, democracy. What's happening is things becoming more level, right? Hopefully you could see how consumerism has this built-in mechanism, so to say, whereby the market could sell things to, the broad spectrum of consumers, whereby things become more level. And even today, like I said, middle-class person can consume the same things. It may be harder for them. They may have to save or use credit, but they can consume the same things that their social betters can. It makes things more horizontal rather than vertical. Okay, so let's move on to the next unifying experience, which is religion.